He was a heavyweight champion, a preacher, a pillar of his community.
Berbick comes back with a right hand.
But behind closed doors, Trevor Berbick was hiding something sickening, because beneath the glory, he was living a double life. A man of God who committed fraud, assault, and a crime so horrifying I almost don't want to say it out loud. And in the end, his own family turned on him in the most brutal way imaginable. He might have talked about morals in church, but outside the spotlight, Trevor Berbick didn't have any. So how does a man go from standing over Ali to unraveling into an irrational, violent outcast? To understand how a life so promising took such a dark turn, we need to go back to where it all started. His story didn't begin with fists or fame. It began in Port Antonio, Jamaica, a rural parish where life was hard and futures were small. Opportunities didn't come knocking, and the ones that were there barely knocked at all. For little Trevor, boxing wasn't just a dream. It was his escape route from a life that offered little else. And escape he did, barely experienced with just 11 amateur fights to his name. Berbick still made it to the 1975 Pan American Games and somehow snagged a bronze medal. A year later, he was on the Olympic stage in Montreal. He didn't win. He wasn't even close. But there was something fierce about him, an untamed power that was difficult to overlook. He walked away with something more important than a medal. He learned how to take a loss and keep swinging. Instead of heading home, Berbick stayed in Canada, and that choice changed everything. He exploded onto the pro scene. 11 straight wins, 10 by knockout. Raw power, scary power. The kind that sends shivers even while watching from the sidelines. But the cracks didn't take long to appear. On April 3, 1979, Berbick got dropped in the first round by Bernardo Mercado. One punch, lights out. It wasn't just a loss, it was a warning. For a man who saw himself as unstoppable, it shattered the illusion. And the way he handled it, that told us something far more important than any win ever could. Still, Berbick kept swinging, and then came the fight that etched his name in boxing history. December 11, 1981. The drama in Bahama. It was Muhammad Ali's final bout, but let's be honest. It wasn't a fight, it was a farewell tour gone wrong. Ali was nearly 40, heavy, unsteady, and clearly battling the early signs of Parkinson's. Watching it was uncomfortable. Berbick won by unanimous decision.
Unanimous decision for Trevor Berbick.
Well, there you have it. Trevor Berbick is the unanimous decision.
But it wasn't the kind of victory you celebrate with fireworks. It was sad, really, seeing Ali like that. Some called him a villain for taking part in Ali's downfall. Others saw a man who did what he had to do. Either way, his name was added to an exclusive list, the men who beat the greatest. And from that moment on, the boxing world had to take him seriously. Then came his peak. In 1986, he beat Pinklon Thomas and claimed the WBC Heavyweight Championship. That was it, the mountaintop, a belt that signified he had officially arrived. But he didn't get to enjoy the view for long, because just 8 months later, he ran into a wrecking ball named Mike Tyson. Tyson was only 20, young, undefeated, and terrifying. That fight didn't last long. In the second round, Tyson's fists put Berbick on the canvas in one of the most famous knockouts in boxing history.
Should be able to get up from this. His legs may be shut. They are, as Trevor Berbick falls back in the ring.
If you've ever seen those clips of Berbick trying and failing just to stand back up, you know how bad it was. That moment didn't just end a fight, it ended an era. It was the beginning of Berbick's fall, and this time, there was no getting back up. With championship belts come expectations, endorsements, fame, maybe even a little bit of peace in the chaos of life. But for Trevor Berbick, none of that stuck. Success in the ring ran side by side with something darker, a temper he couldn't hide and demons he couldn't shake. Even when he was on top, you could see the patterns emerging. He didn't just have mood swings, he had meltdowns. That loss to Tyson? It wasn't just a knockout, it was a flashing red warning sign. The Berbick we saw was standing in the spotlight. But behind the smiles he gave to cameras, something darker lingered. And even when his boxing career began to fade, he wasn't done throwing punches, even when it wasn't legal. By the end of his prime, the stories started piling up: public outbursts, nagging accusations, personal feuds that bubbled up into ugly, chaotic showdowns. But there was one confrontation that caught everyone off guard. It involved Larry Holmes, but this wasn't part of a boxing card. It was something entirely different. Picture two heavyweight champions, not in the ring, but throwing fists in a hotel parking lot like a couple of drunks. That's exactly what happened between Trevor Berbick and Larry Holmes in one of the most absurd, embarrassing moments in boxing history. It's 1991. Both men are well past their prime. But outside the Diplomat Hotel in Hollywood, Florida, were two men who once headlined arenas, now brawling like angry neighbors in broad daylight. And yes, the whole thing was caught on tape. The backstory? Berbick showed up at a press conference he wasn't invited to, loud, unhinged, and clearly looking for a fight, verbal or otherwise. Holmes, cool as ever, brushed him off like a mosquito. Berbick, though, wasn't about to let it go. He launched into what witnesses called a loud, rambling discourse, making wild accusations that Holmes had used a woman in an attempt to sabotage his marriage. It didn't stop there. Berbick gave the impression that Holmes owed him money, and according to some reports, he threw in insults about Holmes's family for good measure. It didn't matter if any of it was true. What mattered was the unfiltered chaos pouring out of Berbick's mouth, the sheer volatility he was showing. To everyone in that room, it felt like an eruption waiting for a bigger trigger. And a few hours later, that explosion came. In the hotel parking lot, Berbick and Holmes were caught on video shouting at each other. Berbick had reportedly started things up again with a confrontation that pushed Holmes to his limits. And then Holmes snapped. That's when things turned physical. And listen, Holmes wasn't messing around. One of the most memorable moments in this chaotic scene, and the reason that footage went viral long before the days of YouTube, was the sight of Larry Holmes not just throwing a punch, but jumping off a parked car to do it. Yes, literally climbed up a car and launched himself like a WWE stuntman. That punch didn't just land. It cemented the moment as one of the most surreal in boxing lore. The fight itself wasn't pretty. Berbick flailed and seemed more focused on yelling than actually defending himself. Holmes, meanwhile, fed up and focused, let his fists do the talking. It was pure chaos. Shouts, scuffling, bystanders either trying to break it up or record the madness. But this wasn't just an embarrassing scuffle. For Berbick, it symbolized something deeper, something brewing beneath the surface. His meltdown at the press conference, his paranoia, the bizarre accusations, it wasn't new for him. He had always flirted with chaos. This wasn't his first public outburst, and it wouldn't be his last. But watching him completely lose control in front of cameras was different. In hindsight, this incident feels like a red flag, because what should have been dismissed as one bad day now looked like a symptom of something much darker. Because what came next wasn't just troubling, it was sickening. 1991 was supposed to be his comeback year, his big redemption. After getting steamrolled by Tyson, he promised to turn over a new leaf. No more boxing, no more chaos. Or so he said. But instead of rebuilding, 1991 became the year that marked the beginning of the end. And it didn't take long for things to get ugly. It started with a stunning act of violence. Berbick accused his former business manager of stealing $40,000, a serious allegation, but what he did next was even more serious. He held her at gunpoint, not a heated argument, not a legal dispute, an armed confrontation. Witnesses described the way he seemed to fuel the situation. Accusations hurled without much backing, emotional outrage that seemed to burst out of nowhere, and a complete lack of self-control. And this was a man who once preached from the pulpit, a man who claimed to represent God, now threatening someone's life. It wasn't just disgraceful, it was dangerous. And those assault charges? They were the first real crack in the legal dam that was about to burst. But let's not kid ourselves. This wasn't an isolated incident. Just a year later, Berbick found himself in even deeper trouble. This time, the gloves were off. and the crime was cold and calculated fraud. He forged his ex-wife's signature to secure a mortgage. The scheme was simple enough. He wanted the money and decided to drag his own family into the mess to fund his personal desperation. By then, the boxing money had dried up, and his dwindling fortune put him in positions like this, where he gambled with the law and inevitably lost. The conviction for second-degree grand theft only confirmed what was becoming painfully obvious. He was self-destructing, and he was taking others down with him. But even that wasn't the worst of it. Not even close. Later that same year, the most sickening detail of Berbick's double life was finally exposed. He was convicted of rape. It wasn't just another public scandal. It was vile. The victim was a 26-year-old woman who had been working as his children's babysitter. According to her testimony, Berbick had driven to her apartment, forced his way inside, and began removing her clothing. When she resisted, he struck her and pinned her down. The trial was emotional, and when the verdict came in, it was swift, guilty. This wasn't just another story of an athlete caught in legal trouble. This was a crime that laid bare the kind of man he'd become behind closed doors. Not just reckless, not just angry, predatory. This was the point of no return. This was the moment his entire public image, a heavyweight champion, a man of the church, a father, collapsed. That permanent stain on his record didn't just end his career, it obliterated any remaining goodwill he might have had with his fans or even his peers. Whatever respect Berbick once commanded was destroyed. His legacy wasn't tarnished, it was erased. No more second chances, no way to spin it. From that point on, he wasn't just a troubled former athlete, he was a convict. Looking back, 1991 wasn't just a bad year, it was the beginning of the end. That year tore the mask off. It exposed who he really was, not just flawed, but dangerous. And from that point forward, every crime, every court case, every arrest followed the same track: rage, recklessness, and zero accountability. The pattern was clear now. Wherever Trevor Berbick went, chaos followed. And it was getting closer to home. If 1991 marked the fall, then what came next proved there was still a long way down. Because as bad as it had already gotten, Trevor Berbick was nowhere near rock bottom. Not even prison put an end to the chaos. After serving just 15 months for sexual battery and other charges, Berbick charged straight into more trouble the moment he got out. In 1997, he was deported from the States to Canada for violating parole. That should have been the end of it, but Berbick wasn't done making reckless choices. He snuck back into the country. He was caught and deported again, this time for good. In 2002, he was dumped back in Jamaica for the last time, not as a national hero, but as a man exiled from the two countries that had once built his legacy. It was the same sequence: defiance, destruction, repeat. It's like every time life handed him a path to start over, he threw it away. And trouble didn't end with deportation. It followed him straight back to Jamaica and right into his own family's home. In January 2003, just months after his return, Berbick was back in handcuffs. This time, the charge was burglary. And the alleged victim was his own sister-in-law. The items, an electric drill and a pickaxe, hardly the kind of haul that screams criminal mastermind, but that's what made it even more pathetic. His sister-in-law, Gwendolyn Facey, claimed he broke into her home and stole them. Berbick, as always, denied everything. Claimed it was a setup, said the tools were planted. It was just another example of how, in his mind, the world was always out to get him. The case didn't go far. Facey ultimately declined to press charges, and Berbick walked free. But by then, the damage was done. Not to his legal record, but to what little credibility he had left. By 2006, Trevor Berbick's life wasn't just unraveling, it was in free fall. Earlier that year, he was charged with assault for allegedly punching his sister-in-law, the same woman he'd been accused of robbing just 3 years earlier. The details are murky, but the charge itself spoke volumes. This wasn't a stranger on the street or a rival fighter. It was family. And still, the violence kept spilling out of him. At this point, it's hard to call it shocking. It was just Berbick being Berbick. Another headline, another mess, another sign that whatever control he once had was long gone. But maybe there was more to it than rage and recklessness. In 2000, a CAT scan revealed something that should have stopped everything: a blood clot on his brain. His boxing license was revoked immediately. But that diagnosis wasn't just about a health scare. It was a window into everything he had become. Years of punishment in the ring had left invisible damage. And now, it was catching up. Doctors called it chronic traumatic brain injury, CTBI. In boxing circles, it's better known as dementia pugilistica, or what we now call CTE, chronic traumatic encephalopathy. It's the dark side of the sport no one wants to talk about. Memory loss, paranoia, explosive mood swings, unprovoked violence. And when you looked at Berbick, his outbursts, his bizarre behavior, his total inability to stay out of trouble, it all fit. He wasn't just a man in decline. He was a fighter living with the consequences of every round, every punch, every hit he ever took. A walking cautionary tale, and it was only getting worse. Think about it. Here was a man who'd been slammed by some of the hardest hitters in the sport, including Mike Tyson, whose punches were infamous for their destructive power. Add decades of high-impact fights, and you've got a recipe for serious brain trauma. Not just bruises and scars, but real, permanent damage. Damage that creeps in long after the final bell. The signs were all there. He once claimed Tyson's knockout punch had merely passed over my forehead, instead of actually hitting him. Was that delusion? Denial? Or was there something more sinister happening inside his own mind? And the blood clot found on his brain in 2000 wasn't just a medical footnote, it was the smoking gun. CTE doesn't just steal memory, it rewires judgment. It turns irritation into rage and confusion into confrontation. Berbick's life had become a series of escalating disasters. Simple disputes turned into violence, family turned into enemies, and any shred of peace was long gone. By 2006, it seemed like the only certainty in Berbick's life was trouble. But even with everything we'd seen, nothing could have prepared the world for what came next. Because in the end, Trevor Berbick didn't die in a hospital bed surrounded by family. He died violently, suddenly, brutally, and the final blow didn't come from a rival or a stranger. It came from inside his own bloodline. That's where every thread of his chaotic story finally came together and broke apart. The man who had survived the fists of Mike Tyson would be murdered in cold blood by his own nephew. On the morning of October 28, 2006, Trevor Berbick was found dead in a churchyard in his hometown of Norwich, Jamaica. His body was crumpled beneath the open sky, his skull shattered. The wounds were so brutal that police initially struggled to identify the weapon. Chop marks hinted at a machete, but a steel pipe was also suspected. Whatever it was, the message was clear. This was no random act. It was calculated and personal. And it didn't take long for investigators to find the source. The killer was Berbick's own nephew, Harold Berbick. Along with an accomplice, Kenton Gordon, Harold had crept through the night and bludgeoned his uncle to death. The motive? A land dispute. Petty on the surface. But like everything in Berbick's life, the real story was darker. Years of tension and grudges had festered into something lethal. Harold later claimed he feared his uncle. Whether that fear was real or just an excuse, we'll never fully know. The trial painted a chilling scene. Harold and Kenton ambushed Berbick late at night, during or after an argument. It wasn't quick. Berbick fought back, but the blows kept coming. Heavy, deliberate, and fatal. In the end, Harold was sentenced to life in prison with no parole for 20 years. Kenton got 14 years for manslaughter. Justice, in a legal sense, was served, but no sentence could erase what had happened. The fighter who once stood toe-to-toe with legends died not in the ring, but in the dirt, murdered by family. How did it come to this? How does a man who once stood in the global spotlight, who fought legends like Ali and Tyson, end up losing his life in such a raw and senseless way? The answer doesn't lie in one moment. It was years in the making. Berbick's life after boxing was a slow unraveling, and nowhere was that more visible than in his relationships, especially with family. By the time he was deported back to Jamaica, his reputation had worn thin. He wasn't greeted as a returning hero. The people who should have been his source of support became his enemies. For Berbick, family wasn't a refuge, it was another arena for conflict. The irony of his death is difficult to overlook. A man who made a living off strength, resilience, and endurance was blindsided in the end by those closest to him. It was the final collapse, symbolic of the complete breakdown of his life. That 2000 CAT scan revealed more than just a blood clot. It may have held the key to his behavior. We've seen it before, and in Berbick's case, it's not just a theory. It's a likely explanation for the man he became, because by the end, it didn't seem like he could even tell where the real fight was anymore. Still, it's impossible to ignore the role of choice in his downfall. Long before the brain scans and court dates, he made decisions, reckless, violent, and often self-serving. He pushed people away, escalated conflicts, and let paranoia dictate his path. Did that constant war, fought both within himself and against everyone around him, finally drive his nephew over the edge? What's certain is that his life ended in a way no one should have to imagine. For all the pain he caused and endured, Berbick's death was still horrifying. It was the violent final act in a story already heavy with shame, anger, and collapse. He may have been a fighter, but even he couldn't swing his way out of this ending. Champion, churchgoer, convict. His life was a web of disturbing contradictions. He claimed to preach the truth, but lived a life full of lies. Yes, brain damage may explain some of it, but does it excuse the trail he left behind? The broken lives? The criminal convictions? The people that feared him? It's a question boxing fans, and maybe all of us, have to wrestle with. When the lights go out and the crowd stops cheering, what do we owe the men who once gave everything to entertain us? Did Trevor Berbick fall victim to a broken system, or to his own choices? You decide. We want to hear from you, so drop a comment below. And if this story sent shivers down your spine, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to help us keep diving deep into the stories beyond the ring. See you in the next one.